And as an introduction to the Haggadah, we say a particular passage that is found on the first page. And this is the way it goes. So this is what it says. This is from the Rambam. The Nusach Haggadah Shenoga Yisrael B'Zman Hagolus. This is the Nusach. This is the version. This is the liturgy of the Haggadah that's said in time of exile. So this is what you do. Maskal Koi Sheni V'Omer. You start with the second comment. This is what you say. So this is the Rambam writing. Yeah. B'Behilu Yatzanu Mitzrayim. With great haste we left Mitzrayim. It's the first page. You don't have it on the first page? Yeah. So right, there's two little lines right before Ha Lachma Anya. So it says, "Behilu yatzanu Mitzrayim." It says that with great haste we went out of Mitzrayim. Then you start. So it's like an introduction to the introduction. We went out with great haste out of Mitzrayim. And then we say, Ha Lachma Anya, Ha Lachma Anya, the challah of asana b'ared Mitzrayim. This is the bread of the challah of asana that our ancestor ate as in Mitzrayim. There's another version in the Rambam, another girsa that says, "Hey or Ha Lachma Anya da challah v'asana." This is the bread that we ate in Mitzrayim. This is the bread that we ate, the challah v'asana. This is the bread that our ancestor ate. The nafku b'ared Mitzrayim, when they left Mitzrayim, not b'ared Mitzrayim, not in Mitzrayim, not in Egypt, but when they were leaving Egypt. Again, you say whoever's hungry, wherever come and eat, whoever needs, come and feast. This year we're here, next year we're in Israel, Eretz Yisrael. Ashata Avdi. This year we are slaves, enslaved, or oppressed. L'shata d'asya b'nei chori. L'shata d'asya b'nei chori. Next year will be free. So there's a few differences over here than the regular version of the Ha Lachma Anya. Number one is Behilu Yatzanu Mitzrayim. We don't say it, no one says it, only the Rambam says it. Behilu Yatzanu Mitzrayim means with great haste we left Mitzrayim. And it says V'omer, you say Behilu Yatzanu Mitzrayim with great haste we left Mitzrayim. The second thing is not the version that we have over here, is a chalav asana the nafka b'ared Mitzrayim, that our ancestor ate when they left Mitzrayim. The third thing, which is very prominent, is in our version, or the collective version that all of Klal Yisrael, everyone says today, is Lashon haba b'nei chorin. Next year will be free in Lashon HaKodesh. In the Rambam's version, it's L'shata d'asya b'nei chori is in Aramaic. So, what's the difference? Okay, we're going to understand these three distinctions, but we'll go a little bit deeper into this whole passage. So, why do we even start with this, with Ha Lachma Anya? So again, essentially there are three things that you're saying here. One is, we're saying that this is the bread that was eaten in Egypt. The regular version. Ha Lachma Anya chalav asana, this is the bread that we ate in Egypt. Okay. Which bread are we talking about? We can assume Lachma Anya is going to refer to the matzah, right? Lachma Anya is going to refer to the matzah. Lachma Anya is called the bread of affliction, correct. So this is the Lachma Anya. But the Ramak writes in his Pirush on the Siddur, on his Pirush Haggadah, the Ramak writes the chalav asana b'ared Mitzrayim. Lachma Anya doesn't mean particularly the matzah. It refers to the whole meal that we do that's b'derech aniyus. Anything that we do, let's say eating bitzalim, you're eating salt water, and you're eating onions, and you're eating mar, anything that is reminding us of Egypt, the chalav asana b'ared Mitzrayim, lechem is not particularly for bread, but it refers to the meal. A meal is food. Food in general is better.
Anything that you do for school.
Well, no, you do also things for school also for positive. Okay, we'll see soon. Okay, that's one way of looking. But the simple reason is, the simple thing, we're talking about matzah. We're talking about matzah. Second thing is, we say whoever's hungry, come and eat. And whoever's, wants to make a pesach, that's the second statement. You're making three statements. One is the statement that this is the matzah that we ate. in Mitzrayim. The second statement is whoever is hungry, come and eat. And the third statement is here we're in exile, next year we'll be in Israel, here we're enslaved or oppressed, and next year we'll be free. Okay, these are the three statements. The classic reason, the basic reason to start off the Seder and say that called it tzrich and called it chvin, is there's a Gemara in Tainus, the Gemara says to Rabbi Huna, before we start eating, we're not actually talking about inviting people that are not sitting by the Seder. That wouldn't make any sense. That you would have to do in shul. Like after you leave the shul, you would say, called the chvin. You're sitting down by your meal, the doors are locked. Okay, maybe the doors are not locked on Pesach, but you're sitting by your meal and you're a big tzaddik because you're saying anyone that comes is hungry, obviously, who you're talking to. Okay, so it's a statement, it's a declaration that you're giving now. You're ready to give. People around the table, yes. Whoever's around the table, let's come together. The Chidah brings down on this Pirush on the Haggadah, the Chidah brings down something very sweet. It says that in the beginning of the Seder you want to show Rachmim, you want to show Rachmanis. And since the whole idea of the story of the going out of Mitzrayim is that we were in a bad state, and HaKadosh Baruch Hu was merachim aleh, and Hashem had Rachmanis on us and took us out of Egypt, took us out of our constrictions, out of exile. So therefore, Kol merachim al abrius, HaKadosh Baruch Hu merachim alav. If you show merachim al abrius, if you show compassion, then you gain compassion. The doors of heaven are open for you. Okay. But let's try to understand some of the. We'll start with one thing, then we'll go to different details over here. Why is it in Aramaic? Why is it in Lashon Bavel? Now the rest of the Haggadah, the entire Haggadah is in Lashon HaKodesh. The whole Haggadah is Lashon HaKodesh. Besides Ha Lachma Anya is in Aramaic. Why is it in Aramaic? So the simple reason why it's in Aramaic is because that was the Lashon that people spoke. Ha Lachma Anya was created by the Goinim. It's not Talmudic, it's not in the Gemara. There's no Lashon Gemara, we don't have this Lashon Gemara. It comes from the Goinim, Zman HaGoinim. And since the Zman HaGoinim, the time of the Goinim, Rav Minyan and Binyan of Klal Yisrael lived in Babylon. So that was the language, that was the common language. Aramaic was like the Yiddish of Eastern Europe then. It wasn't a real language, only Yidden spoke it. And the language of the Gemara wasn't a real spoken language. It was like a language that had Lashon Kodesh in it and had a few things. It was a Jewish language. The Jewish language is Lashon Kodesh. It was Lashon Aramis. So therefore, the Chazal, the Goinim that wrote it in Aramaic because that was the language you're supposed to understand. And it's very important that you understand the Haggadah. It's fascinating that the Ramah brings down that it's very important that you understand what you're saying in the Haggadah. The Ramah brings down from the Mari of London, Lunderish, which was one of the Balei Atoises that lived in London before the Jews were expelled from London in 1290. One of the Balei Atoises, he says that he read the Haggadah for his family and children in English. So this is that is correct. But if you think that you're reading it in English, that's what it's interesting. It actually has a older history than reading in Yiddish. You understand? If you're reading in Yiddish, that's from the 1300s, 1400s. If you're reading from English, it goes back to the 1100s. So this is interesting.
Is that like this the way this is written, that the Golos mean when it talks about redemption, it's in Aramaic in that native tongue?
Correct. So I want you to understand. So if we look at the Rambam's version that we have over here, the Rambam's version, the Nusach of the Rambam, is everything's in Aramaic. The whole thing's in Aramaic. Hashata Avdi, Lashata de Asi, B'nei Chari. The next year will be B'nei Chari, but it's said actually in Aramaic, which would make sense. It's the local, it's the vernacular. So then the question is, why do we switch over? In our Nusach, we say, Shata Avdi, Lashana Abba, B'nei Chari. Next year will be free, but we say it actually in the Nusach of Lashon Kodesh. Why do we say in Lashon Kodesh? Why do we switch over to Lashon Kodesh? So there's a Kolboy. Kolboy writes that so that's the next page. Not too much turning. The next page. The Kolboy writes that the Maral brings down the Kolboy, but the Kolboy and other Rishonim write this. That Yesh Mefarish L'Chacha B'Lashon HaKodesh, it's on the left column in Gvuras Hashem. That the reason why it's said in Lashon HaKodesh, why we finish with Lashon HaKodesh, Lo Yevina Parsayim HaParsayim Shem Reitzin Livrech. at that point, the Bavel was under the Persian rule, in case you're familiar, the Sassanians. And the Persians were then ruling the parts of Bavel where Jews lived. So therefore, you don't want to say, L'shon haba b'nei chayim, next year you'll be free in the language of the vernacular that maybe someone will speak, because then it sounds like it's a revolt, a rebellion. This is what it says in the Rishonim. Therefore, he says Lashon HaKodesh. Says the Maral, very, very harsh words on this. V'divrei havoye. This is really foolish. This is nonsense. I mean, it says in the Rishonim. By the way, we don't actually. It's just a side note. The Kolboy. I don't know if you're familiar with the Sefer the Kolboy. It's a classic Sefer in Halacha, written from the Zman Rishonim. But we don't know who wrote it. It's not. There's no Messiah exactly who wrote the Kolboy. There is even there's a firm rumor that it was written by a woman. Just wanted to say, by the way. It's a real thing. The Chidah says it's not true, but there was some type of talk that was written by a woman, which is kind of interesting. Anyways, the Kolboy is definitely a safe from that time period, but Divrei Havoy, the Maral dismisses it completely. She'im Kain Hayal Aleim Lashon Haba Ba'eretz Yisrael. It says Lashon Haba. That says also in Aramaic. It says next year Ba'ar Yisrael. Well, next year in Israel, that's in Aramaic. So you say you're going to Eretz Yisrael. Just you say you're not going to be free. V'lam Lashon Haba B'Lashon HaKodesh Ba'ar Yisrael B'Lashon Targum. And what do you say the Lashon Targum Nechayim? So it says it doesn't make any sense. So the real question is, why do we actually say the whole thing in Aramaic, and then just end off with the with B'nei Chorim, the last thing to say in Lashon HaKodesh. Just obviously, if you have a little bit sensitivity, you will understand, before I tell you this, but you'll understand that it was written in a way to transition, right? You're sitting in exile, and it represents some type of transition, and the transition will be from Lashon Arami to Lashon Kodesh. We'll move from a secular language into the sacred language. This will be like an idea of a transition.
You see that in Tefillah, right? With like Kaddish and things like that.
Kaddish is different. Kaddish you don't have Lashon Kodesh at all.
I'm saying the transition from using Aramaic.
Yeah, no, the Kaddish itself is a transition. Correct. We'll see soon about Kaddish. We'll see soon. We'll see. Yeah, that writes like that as well. But this is one thing. The next thing, I think, a basic question, well, before we even get to this, is you're sitting down by the night of freedom, the night that represents that you're free, that you're chayros, and you're reclining, and everyone should be like a melech and a ben melech. And the first thing you're acknowledging is that you're a slave and that you're in exile. Okay, yeah, but and you don't have freedom of speech because you're afraid that someone's going to listen to you. First of all, this whole thing about someone listening to you, who's that guy that's listening to you? Who's that parsoi that's going to hear you say Lashon haba b'nei chorim? If the guy is a guy outside your house, how's he going to hear you saying it? If it's a guy that's sitting by your seder, Lamazog, that the guy is actually sitting by your seder for some reason. I don't know. You have this important guy and he's a parsoi, he's sitting there. So if you can explain him what this means, what it means in Aramaic, you can explain what it means in Lashon Kodesh. I mean, what's the difference? So it's really a little bit of tzarachin to this svara to say that it's because you're afraid that someone's going to hear it. It's kind of strange. Or else it was said in a different context. It's possible. It's possible historically it wasn't said by the Seder. It's possible that it used to be said in Shul.
Is that line of thinking possible even the genuineness of inviting people to come?
Correct. That's right. So if you say that it was done in Shul, and it was public, it was a public declaration, but still, it's very complicated. It's a very complicated reason.
Maybe it's because they would read the Haggadah, like censorship and like that.
That's something else. So then you have the same problem because they're going to ask you what this means, and you're going to have to explain it to them. So if it's censorship, and censorship was not done no, of course not. Censorship was only after the printing press. There was no censorship before that. There was they were burning things, but they weren't censoring. Censoring is only after the printing press. Okay, so that's a question. But the bigger question is, you're sitting down for the night of freedom. It represents the day of freedom, and you're saying that you're going to be free. And what do you talk about? That there are people that are struggling, and people don't have food to eat, and people are in pain, and people are in exile. Okay, so then the question is the reverse question. So why are you celebrating? You're celebrating a night of freedom, and then you're saying there are poor people in the world. And poor people can actually be your friends because they could be the people that you're invited to your house that are poor. And poor could mean not necessarily kol dechvin yesav yechel. Let's say we say that it represents a metaphor, that those who are hungry can come and eat. We're saying that there are people that are hungry, people that don't have knowledge, people that are chasadas. that they're in Golas Adas, let's say, that they don't have correct awareness. Okay, so there are people that are in a state of exile. If they're in a state of exile, so then what are you celebrating on Pesach night? What is actually the celebration? If in fact you're still in exile, you're still not in Eretz Yisrael, you're not in a redemptive state, and the world is not redeemed, and there are people that are still struggling and people still enslaved. So what are you celebrating? Okay. The next thing is, when actually the phrase is kind of interesting. What are you saying? You're saying, Ha Lachma Anya, Ha Lachma Anya, this is the bread that our ancestors ate. So look at the Magen Avram. This is the bread that our ancestors ate. Now there's just, I know the world says ha, but the Arizal said hey. That's also meaning Chabad, hey. Now the difference between ha and hey is ha means this, hey could mean here. Like hey lacham zera. When Yosef says hey lacham zera, it's not this is the zera, it's like here is the zera that you can go plant. So you could say, hey lachma anya, here is the bread, not this is. But if you say ha, means this, it seems like this actually is the bread that they ate. That somehow you're holding bread for thousands of years, matzah for thousands of years, and this is the bread. So if you look at the Magen Avram actually raises this question. And there's also a Darkei Moshe, but the Magen Avram asks this question and says, when you say Ha Lachma Anya, it refers to the language which the Torah, which is brought down in Tanakh, where it says that this is the bread that you ate, which is the talking about the man, that you were able to see the man, right? It lasted through the time of the first base of Mikdash. Ve'ein l'shabash hanusach v'loimer ki Ha Lachma Anya, aha ki lachma. And he says, the Marivav says you shouldn't change the language and say this is like the bread. This is not the bread. This is not the bread that we ate in Egypt. There's those who don't want to say this is the bread, because that's not the same bread that we ate. It's a different bread. So what it means, so that's what they want to answer, to say that it's like the bread. And they bring a proof from the pasuk. He says, no, it's not a raya. The hasam lokach hatzenanis min aman. Over there by the tzenanis aman, you can actually say the man. You could say this is the bread that we ate when we left Egypt, because even though it's 1,000 years later, but this is actually the bread that was held in the Kodesh HaKodashim. In the Mitzvah. But here we can't say that. But over here, it's a different bread. Every year you bake new bread. You're not holding bread for 1,000 years. So what does it mean, Hey Lachma Anya? So therefore, the Magen Avram says, Ha ki lachma, okay, Hey lachma lo yifsid. If you say Ha ki lachma is like the bread, it's not a terrible idea. You could also say that. Okay, but then we then have to answer the question, so why don't we lachatchila change the nusach to say ki ha lachma anya, like the bread that we ate in Egypt, not ha lachma anya, this is the bread. What does it mean that we're saying that it is the actual bread? And then again, the question was, is it actually? What does it mean? Okay, that's another question. What does it mean? This is the bread that we ate. Let's say that we're talking about that it is like the bread that we ate in Mitzrayim. In Mitzrayim, we ate matzah. We're just say that we ate matzah in Mitzrayim. Now, what we're going to say later is, Gamliel says, if you say these three things, you don't fulfill the obligation. What are the three things? Pesach, matzah, mar, matzah. What's the reason why we eat the matzah? The reason why we eat the matzah is because when we were leaving Egypt, the matzah didn't have time to rise, and therefore we eat matzah. So why do we eat matzah? We eat matzah because when we left Mitzrayim, we ate matzah. Where does it say that we ate matzah in Mitzrayim? Now again, if you go back to the Rambam's Nusach, it's very clear. It says, Bibihilu Yotzana Mitzrayim. That's what the Rambam starts. In great haste we left Mitzrayim. Ha Lachma Anya, the Chalav is son of our Mitzrayim. This is the bread that we ate, not in Mitzrayim, when we left Mitzrayim. Okay, that's very clear. But if we hold to our Nusach, our version that says Ha Lachma Anya, the Chalav is son, what does it mean the Chalav is son of our Mitzrayim? What does it mean that we ate the bread in Mitzrayim? Where does this idea come from that we actually ate bread in Mitzrayim? So there's an Avudram. The Avudram writes like this. Avudram writes, and the Barbanel brings it down. The Barbanel is one of the early Mefarshei Haggadah. But Avudaram writes like this. You have the next page. Avudaram writes, maybe the third paragraph, and maybe 1, 2, 3, 4, 6, 7, 8 lines from the top. Pirush Rav Yosef Azuvi, B'Shem ben Ezra. He says he brings down a commentary from the name of the name of the Even Ezer, that Shayeshvuya Behodu. The Even Ezer was captured in India. The Even Ezer was a traveler. I don't know if you know this, but Even Ezer was actually also in London. All things considered, going back to the original London. But Even Ezer spent some time in London. The Even Ezer, but he's from Spain originally, right? From Andalus. The Even Ezer in the time of the Kusi in the 1200s. Early 1200s. So
Whether he was in London?
no, when he went to London is for sure. That's not a question. Huh? Yeah. Fog. Yeah. He was definitely there. It's right across the channel. He went to the Rashbam's yeshiva. He wrote. Yeah. Anyway, so but this story is not brought. The Even Ezer never brings down this story, but it's a Messiah that b'shem the Even Ezer, that he was once captured and he ended up in India. And they only fed him matzah, and they never gave him matzah. He was a prisoner in a dungeon somewhere in India, and he was only eating matzah. It takes a long time to digest, and it sits in your stomach for a longer period of time. So therefore, that this is what Klal Yisrael did. This is what the Mitzvah did. The Egyptians fed their slaves matzah. Because just as matzah sits in the stomach for a longer period of time, and it takes a long time to digest, so the Avudaram says that's what we say when we say Ha Lachma Anya, this is the bread that we ate in Mitzrayim. Yes, we actually ate in Mitzrayim bread because it takes a longer time to digest. And the truth is, in the pasuk, the Torah doesn't call lechem oini in Shmois, but in Dvarim, the Torah calls matzah lechem oini. What's lechem oini? So the Gemara has a lot of different drashas of what lechem oini. What is this poor man's bread? What is this bread? Dvarim she'oinu l'dvarim harbe, or oini with an aleph, it's a ninus. The Gemara has a lot of different reasons of why it's called. But one is that oini represents ani. Ma ani beprusa. That's like an ani is a broken bread. Therefore, you have to eat a broken bread. Ma ani, that the man heats the thing and the woman puts it in the oven. The same thing also actually done very quickly. So there's a concept that lechem oini means lechem ani, poor man's bread. The Seforna, which is in Italian, also from the later Rishonim, writes that lechem oini means that. That lechem oini is that they used to feed. They used to feed them matzah, and the reason why they used to feed them matzah was not only because what this reason is because it sits longer in the stomach, is also because it is very very simple. It's very simple to make. You just need bread and flour. If you want to make bread, then you need yeast. It's a whole long process. Matzah is the most simple thing to make, and therefore they fed as a poor man. The poor man's bread was matzah. So you have a few reasons, and there's another reason that's given. The Maral brings it soon. Another reason why we give a slave matzah is because matzah becomes edible very quickly versus chametz. Chametz takes time to rise. If you want to feed your slave who has no time, the cheapest possible food with the highest return, which means it'll last the longest in the stomach, it takes the shortest time to make, and it's the cheapest to make, would you give the guy his matzah? So no, that's they're not charging slaves. That's the thing. That's the problem. Yeah. So this is the svara.
So
What?
according to this understanding of Woodrown, is he saying that the Ha Lachma Anya is basically like we're reenacting?
Yes, correct.
So it really the luxury or royalty is pretending to be there.
Okay, let's see. Let's see that. That's a good point. Let's see this in a second. So we have it like this. That Ha Lachma Anya Chalav V'San and Har Mitzrayim could mean, literally, that Ha Lachma Anya actually means the bread. Now, one other point over here is important to make is that besides the fact that poor people would eat matzah and wealthier people would eat because they have more luxury and they have more ingredients, so they can take more luxury to make the bread, and it takes more time. There's another important thing is that the Egyptians were actually the inventors of yeast. The whole concept of bread was invented in Egypt. So yeast was an Egyptian, it's obviously not an invention, but a way to create. In other words, prior to the Egyptian civilization, they never had bread. Bread is a phenomenon that was created in Egypt. That's why on a very deep level, when the Torah says not to eat, but it's another conversation. When the Torah says not to eat chametz on Pesach, and also not to eat sor, which is also yeast, the same thing, right? Not to eat beer, is Egyptian. In other words, the Torah wants you to cut away from the Egyptian culture, which Egyptian culture was beer. That's why, in Egypt, they didn't drink water. I don't know if you know this. Historically, they didn't drink water in Egypt because water was contaminated. It was never a good, fresh thing to drink water. Everyone drank beer. Everyone was drunk. So if you can imagine the story of Yitzias Mitzrayim, Moshe Rabbeinu coming to Pare, and everyone was drinking beer. Then you can use your imagination how the story went down. But it was definitely not water. No one drank water. There was no such thing as water. The people were very, very poor people drank water and they died. So everything was fermented and was done through it was done beer. Beer was like the drink, huh?
What was the issue of that? How did it affect it?
Well, you can't make beer if you don't have water. You need to make water. It's you take the water and then you do something with the water. But they needed yeah. So anyways, the whole concept, the whole idea of Mitzrayim is a culture seeped in yeast, which is fermentation. So fermentation also represents, obviously fermentation is Eitzahara and it fermentates, and Kesorim should be so you have all this imagery, but it's fascinating that if you think about it, if you pull it out and you say, like, why is the Torah so against eating any type of piece of chametz on Pesach? Because we have to get away from the Egyptian culture. That's all. It's matzahs. Uges matzahs. Yeah, it's matzah. If I can't, it's actually matzah, and there it's brought down. It's crackers, and that's why it's brought down in Paskin. That's why we make round matzah. Correct. Chametz was invented in Mitzrayim. That's what chametz is. That's why the surah chametz is exactly like the surah avodah zarah. They parallel each other. It's also by na, and it's mamashu, all the same things because they're parallel the same idea, which was the avodah zarah of Mitzrayim, idol worship. So let's just go back into what we're saying over here. Is that the Chalav of Son of Mitzrayim refers to a type of eating that happened in Mitzrayim. Comes along the Maharal, and the Maharal writes on this. Again, maybe we missed this piece of Maharal. Yeah, it's unfortunately it's the page right before this. The Maharal says on this Abarbanel and Avudaram and Sephorna, it's brought down in many. The Maharal writes in Gvuras Hashem Nun Aleph. It's a page before this, no, we don't copy. The Maharal writes that it's impossible. This doesn't make it. It's impossible because there's no hint for this in Chazal. So Maharal said that's not the reason. That cannot be the reason why the Ha Lachma Anya, it doesn't refer to that. Maharal has another reason why it's called Lechem Anya. Now, really, the real question is, Lechem Anya means that it's poor bread, but yet, obviously, matzah is bread it's bread of chayros. That's obviously that lahisbik would say lahachmitz. So why are we eating matzah? Because it represents chayros. Matzah is chayros. Matzah represents. Matzah, when you eat matzah, you have to sit by a seva. You have to sit reclining, right? When you eat maror, which represents avdus, you don't have to sit reclining. If I can't, you shouldn't sit reclining. When you eat matzah, you should sit reclining because matzah is chayros, right? Matzah represents chayros. So if matzah represents chayros, how does that come together with actually matzah also representing anias or the poverty or something called lechem anya? How does it matzah include both those elements to it? So there's a Maharal. There's a long Maharal, but the Maharal basically writes like this. It's a really fascinating piece of Maharal. And he says like this. Incidentally, there's Yosef Gikatalia, who's a student of Rav Abulafia, writes that matzah is called matzah lechem oini because the light, the oil that you receive from eating the matzah is such a high oil that it blinds you. So that's going to be like more like the Moichem Da'abas. So it's like a very blinding light. So it's not that because it's aniyas, that it's something poverty that within you, but it's on the opposite. So we're going to try to understand if matzah has some type. Huh? It's so powerful. Like you ever looked into the sun? So it causes you pain. In other words, the light is so dense,
And the poor
so
person,
it overpowers you. So for the poor, it feels like a poor person. You feel poor when receiving it. Right,
No, but
right.
it's
Some,
also a
some,
poor person's like considered
like a dead person.
no, like a poor person is considered like a blind person.
Right, that's what you're saying. Yeah, that's exactly what you said.
Like,
Exactly.
if you have all
Yeah.
this money
Yeah.
to a poor person, they wouldn't know what to do with it.
Correct. So it's something like that. It's too high. Okay, let's see what the Maral says. The Maral writes like this: that the Maral says that there's Matzah Anya and Matzah Ashira. So he says like this: Haniyas alacheres. It's in the middle of the right column. Haniyas alacheres alishnei afachim. Alacheres haniyas. Poverty and freedom seem to be two opposite ideas. Poverty means something that's someone that's not freed. He says, "Ein zakasha." Kaniyas ba'atzmei ra lagula. This is fascinating. It's the famous Maral. It's called the Torah Hafachim. I don't know if you know about this teachings of Maral. Maral has something. This is a very classic Maral. Later, in Avodas Halevi, Aaron Shashal is also very into this. It's Torah Hipuch, where you take one thing and if you understand it from one perspective, it looks one way. But if you go deeper, it's actually represents the totally opposite of that idea. So sometimes when something looks like one way, in the Torah Hipuch, you flip it around, and actually that thing that you think is negative is actually the source of its positive. This is what the Maral is going to do with which the idea of poor. He says that you think that being poor, or the idea of poor and freedom are two opposite ideas, right? You think if you're rich, then you're free. If you're poor, the opposite. He says, no, not so much. He says, actually different. And this is what he says. That Ein zakushi ki aniyas ba'atzmei ra lagula she'ein inyan hagula rak sheyoytze ve'ein l'shum tzirif azulase lo k'may evet she'ein oim b'matzvi yesh tzirif azulase b'adin l'chein adav she'esh b'asi is ein oim b'matzvi rak u'dlei tzirif from kinyane. This is a fascinating idea. Wealth is a dependent. When a person says they have money, let's say, means I am me, and part of who I am, if I define myself as a wealthy person, right? Part of who I am, if I say I'm wealthy, is I'm mitzvah of myself with something else. In order for me to call myself a wealthy person, I need a tziruf. I need a combination. I need myself and I need my money. Together with my money, now I'm considered a wealthy person. Freedom. What's the definition of a person that's enslaved, or in the concept of slavery? Slavery means that a person is a dependent on something else. That a slave has no independence. Like Mashakana Evan Konarab, whatever you do, the master receives. They don't have their own time. They don't have their own luxury. They don't have their own space. Everything that they own in their time and their space belongs to someone else. Which means this person's life is wrapped into a dependency on someone else.
So a wealthy person is a slave.
That's correct. He said by definition, if you're wealthy, you are enslaved to the money that you have. If a person has nothing, listen to the reverse. If a person has nothing, all they have is themselves, right? There's no tziruf. Say, I exist for myself. Let's say I'm a happy person. Why am I happy? Because I want to be happy. Not because I made money or because I gained something or I did something. If I am happy because I got something new or I received something then I'm a dependent on that thing. The moment I don't have that thing, a little less of me exists. So that means my life is geflochten, is like bound to that particular object or situation. The definition of someone that's free is someone that is a self-dependent. Someone that doesn't need. This can be also in terms of, let's say, if your sense of self or self-esteem comes because another person validates your existence and says, "Oh, you're very smart," and you say, "Okay, therefore, yeah, I'm very smart." You're a slave to that person's opinion. The moment you become dependent on another person or another thing, then you're dependent on that and you're enslaved to it. This is the definition of slavery. Slavery means that I am not an independent. The thing that has less, paradoxically, this is Torah Hipuch, the opposite way of thinking of things. The thing that actually has less has the possibility of being more of itself because it's not dependent on anything else. Now you could be a very wealthy person, right? You could be an ashir, but have an onidas, which means you say the money doesn't make me, therefore cannot break me. Okay, that's a healthy way. That's a healthy attitude. But if a person walks around with a lot of self-pride because they have a lot of money, and they become more chashiv in their own eyes because they have a lot of money, or because they have a lot of things, whatever they have is something dependent on them, or they're very popular, they have a lot of friends. I don't know if that's the reason why you feel good about yourself. Then you're dependent on that thing and you're enslaved to that. If you are a very healthy person and you just feel good about being yourself, and you happen to have money and very popular, and that's fine. But he's saying the concept of the idea of wealth is that it's a tziruf, and therefore if you become connected to that reality, that represents slavery, versus a person that's an independent is freedom. So he says that also works with all the different types of things. When you talk about lachmā anya, first of all, lachmā anya means poor man bread. So it means a person that literally doesn't have a lot. Doesn't have a lot, so he becomes more, in a way, more free, because he's not dependent. He says that's why, in terms of the ingredients, matzah has less ingredients. If you say in order for this bread to be a perfect bread, it needs sugar, it needs spice, it needs yeast, it needs all the things, okay, then it's dependent on these things. If I say this bread only needs flour and water, it's still dependent, actually, right? You still need flour and water, but it's not a dependent, it's only a few elements. Same thing also with time. This is what Maral does with the same thing with time. He says, if you say this takes to ferment an hour, in order for it to become a proper bread, it has to rise for an hour. Okay, so then it depends on time. It cannot be without the dependency of that hour of time. So the least time it has, the less dependent it is. The least objects it has within it, the less dependent it is. It's more free it is. So the Maral comes along and says, what you think a lechem oini, which means bread of poverty, which means that it doesn't have a lot, because it's very simple. It's not matzah shira. It doesn't have a lot of different tastes in it. It's very simple. It's produced very quickly, and it doesn't use a lot of amount of time to create, and it's very cheap. That means that it has an element of cheres. What's that? Into only two ingredients. That means that it has it has an embodiment of the quality already of cheres within itself. Now this is the oimik of what matzah is. So in other words, what is matzah? Matzah is the matzah is basically an existence that has both a representation of anius, because it's matzah oini, of poverty, and yet paradoxically it also has freedom, which means it's really Ha Lachma Anya son of Mitzrayim means whether we're going to read it as the Barbanel and the Avujam, which means literally that they ate in Mitzrayim, or you're going to read it like the Rambam, which is when they were leaving Mitzrayim. But the Nekuda, the depth of what it's saying is that this is the bread that represents, on one hand, it represents our slavery and our place of anius, but if you really understand it deeply, this in itself has the Nekuda of freedom already. With the depth of this reality is actually freedom. You look at it as something and say, okay, what is the free? It's actually the opposite. No, he said, no, if you go deeper enough, and you understand it, it actually paradoxically, it's actually the clue to freedom. And in a way, it holds the tension between both freedom and slavery. That's what matzah is. On one hand, it's matzah is matzah cheres. This is what the Ramban writes in Dvarim, that it's matzah represents matzah of cheres, of freedom, and also represents matzah of anius, because it holds that place and the recognition that in that place, and sort of it's in a way of saying it, it's sort of the transition. You have freedom on one hand. Let's say if you wanted to map this out, you have freedom on one hand, and you have slavery on the other hand, and then you have an in-between state that's coming from a place of slavery, because Achal of son of Aaron Mitzrayim, and there's a possibility that they ate in Mitzrayim, and Kol Ditzrich and Kol Dichvin means there are people that are hungry, and Ashata Avdi, and this year we're enslaved, and this year we're not in Eretz Yisrael, which means this is the negative side, right? This is the enslaved side, the Egypt side, and the side of the poverty. Here's the side in Israel of cheres, of geula, of redemption, right? So what is matzah? Matzah is like the in-between state that we ate as we're leaving Egypt, or even in Egypt. Let's say eat both ways, but the point is that it represents the movement from point A to point B. So it actually holds the tension between these two things. It allows us to transition from slavery to freedom, to go to place from anias to place of ashiras. This is the nekuda. That's why this whole structure of the Ha Lachma Anya is a balancing between these two things. You're saying here, kol tzrich means a person that's a tzrich, someone that doesn't have, which is lack. So kol tzrich yesav means I have enough. So here's a person that's poverty, and here's another person that says that I have enough food to feed you. The balance. He's saying call someone that needs yifsach could come and go. Hashta avi shana haba. This year we're here, next year we're there. This year we're enslaved, next year we'll be freedom. we're holding these two sides of these geometrical two sides of spectrums of what the whole entire Seder is, and where is it represented? What's holding the place? That's the idea of the matzah. Okay, so this is the reason why. This is the oimik. This is the deeper reason why we're going to move from Lashon Aramis to Lashon Kodesh. This is why we're going to move from these two places. So let's read very quickly. You can read this more by Arichas on your own, but let's read very quickly from the Shalar Kodesh. So the Shalar Kodesh has a piece on this Ha Lachma Anya, and he says like this. It's the so he says like this. Okay, we can actually start from the second page. Okay, the first page is also good, but this is Haggadah Beis. We'll read quickly. That Unkelis, who's a translator of Torah Shabiksav, Unkelis represents Klippas Noiga, which is, what is Klippas Noiga? It's not Shalosh Klippas Atmeis. Huh?
Intermediary.
Eliki Arizal. What do you mean? Yeah, that's what Arizal stands for. What do you mean? The godly, the saintly. Yes, by the way, there was a big controversy when they started writing this about that. Unkelis, who is a ger, a convert, represents a klippas noiga. The klippa that is like a glowing husk, which can either be shalosh klippas atmeis or can turn into kedusha. It's like at the in between. The noiga l'sav, like this, the light that surrounds it. Vi klippa nechelas apri. This is the klippa that's actually eaten with the fruit, right? The fruit represents the kedusha, which has the highest what you can eat. There's a klippa that surrounds it, but sometimes it's a hard shell that you can't crack, which represents something that's not edible. So shalosh klippas atmeis. And then there's something that's edible, which means that it's therefore, he says Targum is Karav Lashon Kodesh. The Targum, the translation of the Torah, is the Klippas Nogi that's close to Lashon HaKodesh. It's the closest thing to Lashon HaKodesh. And then he goes into a whole arichas about Lashon Arami, and okay, you can read this, and then let's see what weiter. And then he goes to the end. Mamish to the end, that he says that at the end everything will be redeemed, and in other words, you're going to go from now. Ha Lachma Anya is all going to be Lashon Aramis, which is going to be Aramaic, which is Klippas Noiga, represents the in between, and then eventually you'll reach a point where everything will be translated and it will become Lashon Kodesh, which comes to the original language. Okay, so let's think about this. What this means very quickly. There's various languages in this world, and there's something that's Lashon Kodesh. What's Lashon Kodesh? So Lashon Kodesh is like this. That the reason why it's called Lashon Kodesh, the sacred language, is like the Ramban writes in his famous letter. That the Ramban writes that the reason why it's called Lashon Kodesh is because it's the Lashon of the Bria, it's the language of creation, and the language of revelation. Nevuah and the Bria is through Lashon HaKodesh. So let's think about this in terms of the language. HaKadosh Baruch Hu is revealing His presence in this world, and everything that's created in this world is with Var Hashem Shemayim now. So everything is created with the divine, with Hashem's words, right? Masar Maris Nivra Elam. Everything is created with the sound. It's a divine sound. There is what we'll say. There is like the original sound, and then there's the echoes of the sound. So the original sound, the original sound is Lashon HaKodesh. What does it mean Lashon HaKodesh? Lashon HaKodesh is like the primal sounds of the universe. That's what really Lashon HaKodesh is. It's even higher than the words. Words already, it's really ah and ba. Aleph is already when it becomes a ready form. But then there's a way it exists in its pure form. It says ah and it's ba. And it depends how you put the vowels on it in the Gudas. So in its pure form, once you have Aleph, it's already a Tzura. I'm not talking about the Tzura. So Tzura has already particular form. When it says Basar Moras Nivra Olam, means there's a certain divine sounds that create the world, and then audible sounds that are created in the world, and then these vibrations are mitzaref into different types of in different types of tziruf and different types of combinations, and those combinations give rise to, let's say, trees, plants, whatever they are. This is another tziruf. So the Torah, it says, "Vayom Hashem yihi or, vayi or." Let there be light. There was light. So the tziruf of Aleph Vav Reish, which is or, that sound, not Aleph Vav Reish, or, the sound of Aleph Vav Reish together, and that sound is the root cause of light, the meta root cause of light. So if you want to understand what the shulchan is, what a table is, shulchan is shin lam ches nun in that siruf, in this combination. Okay? So when you call a table a shulchan, you're calling it if you're calling it a Lashon HaKodesh, you're calling it in its pinim reality. What's its pinim reality? What's its internal reality? What's its correct form? The correct form of this shulchan is shin lam ches nun. Now, what happens if you call a table, you don't call it a shulchan, you call it a table? Right? Like people in America call a table a table. So, and a table doesn't sound like a shulchan. It's a completely different word. What does that word mean? You can say, or one way you can say, is that all other languages, and this is what the Ran writes in the beginning of the Dharm, it's a Lashon HaKodesh, which means it's a consensual thing. The fact, it's a consensus that table is called table and chair is called chair, but technically, a chair can be called a table can be called a chair. It doesn't really change. If everyone decides to call a chair, and a chair a table, so the table will become a chair, and the chair will become a table. That's Lashon HaKodesh. That's one way of understanding. Or there's a deeper way of understanding, is that, why was it Lashon HaKodesh? In other words, there had to be some type of consensus amongst people that were created that the fact that there are millions of people, or thousands, or hundreds, whatever other people are calling these things by these names, this means that this is the letter combination of the achorayim of this original sound. So there's an original sound, and then there's an echo of a sound. You have the word, let's say, or. What's that?
So many languages.
Correct. So everything is a variation, some type of variation, some type of other tziruf from the original or. Now it's diluted into different combinations where it can sound like light. It doesn't sound like or. But the original, if you can trace it back, and you can't, it's a metaphysical idea, but if you can trace it back, you would say that this is the panim reality, this is the internal reality. When I call a table, a shulchan, I'm saying what the table actually is. When I call a table, I'm saying what it represents. Because what it really is actually a shulchan, it's not a table. Are you following? Are you following? In other words, the or pnimi, this is what the Arizal writes, that there's bechinas achorayim, the backside, and there's bechinas pnim, there's the direct side. The direct side of calling something is calling it its an original form. And the backside of it is calling it its other language. By definition, if you're listening, the correct language is the redemptive language. That's gula. What is gullus? Gullus means, what is exile? Exile means you're not in the right place or in the right time. That's what it means, right? I'm estranged. I'm supposed to be somewhere else, or I'm supposed to be somebody else, or be in a different time or a different place, right? That's what it means exile, which means there's a certain vibration that's allowing me to be now in this state, but that's not my correct state. I'm just an achorayim of a pnim state. Now I still exist. You can be, let's say, technically a person's really in exile, or a person's really in jail. Physically they're in jail, which means the conditions that surround them is that they're here, but really they should really be here. So what's the reality that they're here? The reality of being here is the backside of what their true reality should be. It is a reality, because in fact is the person's in prison, the person's estranged, the person's in exile. But it's the backside of the truth of who they could be. That's what exile is. Exile is an estrangement of the pnim of who a really person should be. When a person says a galus and das, when a person has correct awareness, and a person is connected to their neshama, and connected to the deepest who they are, then they're pnim. When a person is estranged from that place, they're achorayim. They're functioning in a place of achorayim, in a place that's external to it. So pnim is their inner reality. The chutz is the external. The all other languages is the bechinas achorayim. This is what Ba'omek is in terms of language. So language itself, there's the Gaulish language, which is the language of exile, which is not the original language. There's the original, which is the original place and the original being and the original way to be things, and everything else is in its not correct form is a Gaulish version of that, is an external version of that. That's why even in halacha, I mean, this is just an interesting thing. It's not, we don't have to go too much goimik, but if you find this language in the Ravid, that whatever the Rambam holds that even if you do things in different languages, when you say Krishma in a different language, you have to be medactic b'oisis halashon. You have to make sure that you're careful in the language. Comes along the Ravid and says, "Ein ze mekubel al das." It doesn't really make any sense. If you should call Lashon is pir shem leivris. All the other languages are just a commentary to Ivris. Now the Ravid was a very famous big Makubal. I don't know if you know. He's the father of Yitzchak Saginar. So the Ravid writes, but he doesn't really write so much Kabbalah. He wrote Pirush on the Sefer Yitzir, but in the Ravid he doesn't. But here he's writing something very Api Kabbalah, something very deep. He's saying that all other languages is just a commentary on the original language. So why would you medayik on the commentary? Okay, the Rambam has his own svara, but this is what the Ravid is saying. Pirush means that there's the original form, and then there's the commentary of that form, which is the achoraim of that form. Another Maramaka for this is very interesting. It's from Imir Shefer from the next page, which is from Abulafia, or Ram Abulafia. Abulafia writes, it's very hard to understand Abulafia in general, but this is this one thing. He says, Kitzir for Oisias b'gematria shivim l'shoinos, which is actually a fantastic gematria. That the tzir for Oisias, the combination of letters, is the numeric value of 70 languages. Because what is 70 languages? 70 languages is all different types of sirufim of the original language, all different combinations of the original language of Lashon HaKodesh, which now becomes a different language. Okay, we're going to skip the next two Marmakonis because it's getting late, and we're just going to go to second to the last Marmakon. The last one is over here. This is for Rabbeinu Bechaya, and then we're going to read one other thing. Rabbeinu Bechaya writes like this. This is a fascinating Rabbeinu Bechaya. Rabbeinu Bechaya writes where the pasuk uses a dahav instead of zahav. And Rabbeinu Bechaya says in Zois HaBracha there's a few words that are not Lashon Kodesh. We don't know what the Asa Mervivos Kodesh. What's Asa? There's a few words that the Torah says that are not Lashon Kodesh, or there's no other parallel to this in the Torah for this word. So there's a Ramban on this, and this is what Rabbeinu Bechaya writes. He says that the Lashon Zav, Zayin and Dalid are interchangeable. When you do it into Aramaic, Zav in Lashon HaGemara is Dav with the Dalid. So, Chemetzina Harber Lashonis B'Torah Shu Targum. Read this. Same thing also we find many times in the Torah, we find Lashon HaTargum, the translated language. Well, you got Sadus, which is famous, Shu Targum Gilad. V'chein V'asam Revius Kodesh. Same thing also Asam Revius Kodesh. I skipped a few lines. He just gives a few other examples in Tanakh. V'chein Tipsa Chibra Talmud Hamukdash Sheyesh B'Shtei Lashonis Elam. You see also in the Gemara that the Gemara itself has two languages. It has Lashon Kodesh, Hebrew, and Aramaic. The reason why Ravina Rav Ashi wrote the Talmud, wrote the Gemara in Aramaic that also has Lashon Kodesh in it, because they did exactly what the Torah did. The Torah itself has Lashon Kodesh and one other language, Aramaic. This is a very deep thing, and it has a very strong shayrish, a very strong root for this. Because the name of the Adam, the name of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, is in Lashon HaKodesh. Ukeneged Shem HaShliach, and this is a very, okay, I'm just saying what he says. Keneged Shem HaShliach, and corresponding to the name of the Shliach, the messenger, Shu Targum Umatarton. That Matarton is Lashon Aramaic, it's actually Greek. So this is the language of the Targum is Aramaic. He says I can't really explain any further what this means, but Matarton Sar Shalolim is the considered the angel of the world. What that is, Nar Yisiv Gam Zakanti is Matarton. We're not going to get into this. That's not what I want to say. It's a long conversation. What? Metatron. It's a word. It's in English. Matarton. Okay. So Bekitzer, what he's saying is Rabbeinu Bechai is saying something very fascinating. He's saying that the Lashon HaTorah itself has these two languages, has Lashon Kodesh, has also Lashon Targum. This is the reason why also in the Gemara that has Lashon Kodesh and also has Lashon Targum, has Aramaic. Because it's originally, that's the name of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the name of the Shliach. And he says, I can't really explain it any further. What is the beer? I mean, there's something here, there's something he's saying here. What he's saying is like this, that Lashon Aramis, the Aramaic language, is there's a medrash that says that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is Mechalek Kavod to Lashon Aramis, because a person should Mechalek Kavod to Lashon Aramis because it's the language of Chazal. It's the language that Chazal speak in Lashon. That's the Lashon Hazayir. Everything's in Aramaic. There is, and the way the Arizal talks about Lashon Aramis, about the Aramaic, is that it's the Lashon of the Achoraim of the Pneim, of the backside, which means like this: there's the perfect language, is the original echo, and then there's the reverberation of that original echo. The transition space that allows you. Okay, I think we have to go one more mark. I'm sorry. Go back a second, because there's a lashon over here in the Medrash that says like this: that the Akash Baruch Hu took us out of Mitzrayim. It's a Medrash Tilim Perik Mem Dalet. Asher l'saper ba'ozim benecha liten shvach l'Akadosh Baruch Hu shebana mesapim tilase beina umas. That the reason for Yitzias Mitzrayim, sheyigolam elalasas l'shem ba'olam, that Hashem should create a name in this world, and that we should give, his children should give Tehillah to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, to give thanks to Hashem, bein umas, between the nations of the world. That's the reason why there was the Gula. The reason why we left Mitzrayim is that we should disperse throughout the world, and we should be Mishabeach HaKadosh Baruch Hu bein umas. The next Maramakim in the Sefer HaChinuch writes, very strange, but no, it's this is what he says, that the mitzvah of Haggadah lebincha, Mash Omar Kasal Lebincha, the lav dafke b'noi, that's lav dafke your child. It's a mitzvah b'malef, chaf aleph. Ela filim kol beria. The mitzvah of Siyas Mitzrayim is to tell the entire world that Hashem took us out of Egypt. Yeah, this is the Sefer HaChinuch writes, and this is what the Medrash is saying. What is it? Let's try to understand. What is blaming? What are we saying? We're saying it's like this. Klal Yisrael originally. Not originally, but when we become a people, we live in Eretz Yisrael. That's our language. Lashon HaKodesh is the indigenous language. This is the language of Gula. This is the language of Nevuah. This is the language of prophecy. This is the language of revelation. Klal Yisrael that ends up being in Bavel and ends up being in all different places. What's the tachlis of being in all these places? The tachlis is to gather up all the, in simple languages, that we should shabeach HaKadosh Baruch Hu ben omas, that we should thank Hashem and bring Hashem's presence into this world. How do we do that? We do that by collecting all the other languages of the world and reuniting them with the Pnim, with the Lashon HaKodesh. Okay, let's think like this. If Lashon HaKodesh is the origin, that's the state of the Gula, right? That's the state of creation in the state of Gan Eden. And then Misham Yiparad, and then there's a separation, and it becomes Shivun L'Shoinus. After the Deraf Log, it becomes into the various languages. It means it comes from a place of Achdus, and then it's misparat into many pratim. It comes into many details. We end up being in all these places around the world with different languages. What's the tachlis of that intention? The tachlis intention is to gather up all the other languages, that they should be a reflection of the original language. Now, what does it mean, tachlis? What does it actually mean if you come? When you look at a table, right, and you say table is a table, or you say a table is a shul. When I say the word shulchan, let's say I'm speaking in the original language. What I'm saying is that the shulchan is not a physical table. It is a physical table as well. But what really enlivens this physical table is actually the koyach halaki, which is shin lav ches nun. So when I'm looking at a table, I'm seeing the koyach halaki, the divine animating force that exists within the table. That's what I'm looking at. That's what I'm trying to see. That's my connection to it. I'm trying to see with every single bria in the entire creation. That's what I'm trying to see. I'm trying to see the face of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, right? And all the pratei bria. But then when I come to speak a different language, and I speak Lashon Aramis, or I speak English, and I look at a table and I think of it as table, how am I misyached this? How do I create a yichud with the word table? If the tzir for ois is created the shivim l'shoinus, there's the various combinations created l'shoinus, means I have to recreate the table and return it back into Lashon HaKodesh. How do I return it back to Lashon HaKodesh? Not by dismissing the word table. Dismiss the word table, there's no table. Say that the word table itself also expresses Hashem's presence. When I say it in English, when I say Hashem's presence is revealed in the word table, that means that even table now becomes what? Lashon HaKodesh. In other words, in the ultimate, I don't know why I'm coughing, in the ultimate redemptive state, maybe I should follow the
No,
Bein Bechaya.
anymore.
Bein Shai Lahachiv Adavar. Maybe it's a problem. That the vort is that if you return every sound back to its original sound, what you're doing, L'safa Brura, of the Kulam Shachem Bechad, L'safa Brura, what's the original language? When you're creating, what is the Lashon HaKodesh of the Lashon? Let's think about that. What's the Lashon HaKodesh of the Lashon? The Lashon HaKodesh of the Lashon is when every single detail of the Bria, which means every single sound of the Bria, screams Hashem Echad. That there's no Japanese and Chinese. There's Chinese and Japanese, but what does it say? Why is Lashon Kodesh called Lashon Echad? Because it's Megal Hashem Echad. So when every single language in the world is Megal Hashem Echad and the Kud of Achdus, then there's a redemption of that state. You're following? So it's the inclusion of all the sounds of the world back into the original Lashon Kodesh. So when we're talking about a night of Pesach, let's get to understand this in terms of this structure. We're talking about a night of Pesach. What we're saying is that we start Ha Lachma Anya, all of a sudden we're talking Lashon Aramaic. We started with Lashon Aramaic. Why are we starting with Lashon, that language of Aramaic? Because we're saying we're actually in Galus. Because Hashata Avdi. And we're slaves. And we're not in Eretz Yisrael. At least not in Eretz Yisrael Enslavement. We're not there. Right? So we're saying that we're still in a state of exile. So then why are you celebrating? Because you're saying that Ba'oimek, the fact that I'm here in Torah Sahipuch, if I understand this deeply, I understand that there's an or in this Choshech. I just have to magal it. I have to understand how this aniyas, how this poverty is actually ashiras, is actually chayers. I just don't understand it yet. I see it as aniyas, and I see I'm stuck, and it's a hakt, and I'm in Golas, and yeah, but the Eibush says, if you understand the Torah Sahipuch, you understand that the Noisa Afachim, the Matzah is telling you that in this Choshech is actually the Makav Or. You just have to chap the Or. So therefore you say it in Lashon Aramis. You start off with say Ha Lachma Anya, Lashon Aramis. And then you go at the end, Hashat Al Shalom Lechaim, Lashon Kodesh. Because what is the Tachlis? Tachlis is to get to Lashon Kodesh. It's not the exclusion of all the Aramis into Lashon Kodesh. You're taking all the Aramaic, and now you're including it now into Lashon Kodesh, which is Lashon of redemption. So that's why it's important when you say the Haggadah. For you, I don't have to say this, but for everyone who's listening that doesn't know the language, it's important to say some of the Haggadah in Taka Lashon Kodesh. Why? Because Lashon Kodesh means the redemption of the language in its state of pnim versus state of chutz. When it's a state of exile, then it's take chutz, is separated from its original form. Then it's that's definition of galus. But when you can speak it in the Lashon Kodesh as an original sound and say this is the way it is, this is the emes of this vort. And then just to conclude with a murder vort from the Chayzer Lublin. The Rebbe Lublin chazers this, and I think Shlomo said it to people if you have it. He says in Parshas B'Shalach, you have it? Parshas B'Shalach, the Chayzer says like this. Just a short word. He says, "Chen shamatim Rav Magid Muzlotchev." He says he heard from the Muzlotchev Magid, Michal Muzlotchev. Sheba oisius hasipur, when your person repeats the oisius, the language of the sipur of the story. Let's say a person is talking about Yetzias Mitzrayim, about the going out of Egypt, and saying the story in Lashon Kodesh. Ma'or mashoyer shal anisim. You ma'or the shoyer shal anisim of the miracles. Why? Because the shoyer shal anisim is the language. In other words, when it says and the water split, the Torah is not describing what happened. The Torah is saying this is the way it happened. The language itself is the oil that created the splitting of the sea. So when a person chazes over Lashon Kodesh and chazes over his words, he's ma'or hashoyer shal nishim ki yakol ba'oisius. This is the vart. Everything's in the language. Everything's in the oisius. So when you chaz it, when you repeat over the oisius in Lashon Kodesh, and you're saying or here's Samsuf, whatever you're saying, you takamor. This is the mocker for all the skulas of things of people saying Parshas Amon and all the skulas. What are you doing? You ma'or the shoyrish, the root by going to the meta root of that thing. Man is expressed through the shoyrish amount, through the oisius. And then the Kudah is this is the Kudah of the whole Ha Lachma Anya, that we have to get to the place of Gula and the redemption of Meir V'Yamenu. Amen.